Hi, everyone. We're just welcome. We are just going to wait a minute so that we can allow people to jump in. It's like we have people coming in at a steady pace. So this is good news. We have a lot of people joining us today from all around the country. So pleased to have everybody carve out the time. We think this is an important subject, and obviously you did as well. That's why you're here, and definitely appreciate your time and participating, hearing and participating in the discussion. And just a few more seconds and we'll get started. Okay. Well, again, welcome. I am Tabitha Mancini. I'm the director of Winston Online, and Winston Online is our Winston Preparatory's online campus. Also under this umbrella is Winston & College, and Winston & College offers academic support services to college students around the country, regardless of the college or university program that they're in. And today we have three stellar panelists to discuss what to expect in college from a disability services perspective. And our discussion is going to be framed around four major topics: the differences in secondary and higher education learning environments, what to know about accommodations, student pitfalls and successes, and what to do to prepare for college. All very, very large topics. We could have a webinar easily. We could be together for all day on each one of these topics, but we do have an hour, so I'm going to guide the conversation. So let's jump in by asking our three panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their career backgrounds. Emily, if you can start us off, that would be wonderful.
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name is Emily Tarkanish. I'm a former director of a disability services office at a small liberal arts university in Massachusetts. And after doing that, I obtained my PhD in educational psychology, studying post-secondary education and disability. I'm currently a professor of special education, well, I'm assistant professor of special education at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And my role, what I do in the special ed department is really teach future high school teachers how to prepare how to prepare their students with disabilities for post-secondary education and post-secondary employment.
Thanks, Emily.
Of course.
Lori, if you can go next, that would be great.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. So happy to be here with all of you and my friends and colleagues to talk about this really important subject. My name is Lori Como. I have worked for the past 25 years in disability and higher education, primarily in the college setting. I currently own and branched off with a company about 3 years ago, Como Coaching and Academic Support. I primarily have worked with students with ADHD and learning disabilities. And really now I'm trying to kind of reach parents sooner. So this is a great topic and really opportune time because we're looking to kind of get parents in the know sooner rather than later so that students are in the know so that the trajectory of the outcomes can start to change. So I'm really excited to be here today. I've worked at universities such as University of Connecticut and Westfield State University and Landmark College, and have sat on committees that do things like academic adjustment for foreign language and have worked with student athletes as well with ADHD and learning disabilities.
Thanks, Lori. Judy.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to say to the participants, you are congratulated for attending this webinar because it's really important and you might have a leg up on information that hopefully we'll impart to you today. I've had 40 plus years of experience working with young adults and adults with various disabilities, and 20 of those years I was the director of the Student Accessibility Office at Yale University. When I began there, the office was a year old. I started with approximately 200 students that I knew that were registered with the office. And by the time I left there in retirement, there were over 2,000. Interestingly enough, a majority of those students had learning disabilities, ADHD, but there was always a combination of a variety of medical conditions, and also worked with faculty, staff, students at the undergraduate, graduate, and professional school level. So hopefully we can give you some good advice today.
Thanks, Judy. And I think it's important to note also that you have also testified in OCR cases. So for people who don't know what OCR is, the Office of Civil Rights. And so if a student or a family has an issue, they feel like that there's some discrimination, sometimes they can file a complaint with OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, and then it's can be disputed or settled. But Judy has been an expert witness and testimony. How do you say that? You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah,
You've
pretty
testified.
much based on experience, yeah. So
I think that that's important to also to mention. And I think so between the three of you, there's about, I think there's somewhere between like 60 and 75 years, something like that, of experience in this field. So it represents a lot. And how many students would you say that you've all worked with? Is there a number? That's probably a very difficult
I'll say thousands.
question.
I would say the same at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the lower end of thousands.
A lot. So that's to say a
Yeah,
lot. And
yeah.
and both Judy and Emily also have had experience also working with in agencies and state agencies, rehab agencies as well. So on that employment front, they also have
Correct.
a great amount of experience in that arena as well. So thank you for being here and taking part and being a panelist. The first topic that we're going to discuss is the differences in secondary and higher education learning environments. And there are many differences between the K through 12 learning environment and that of the higher ed environment, both in terms of the legal framework and the actual learning environment. And I'm wondering, Emily, being a professor of special education and a faculty member in higher education, can you start us off with a discussion of the differences from your perspective?
Absolutely. And I will say this is probably one of the most important pieces of information for people with disabilities to have, and their parents too, because higher ed and K-12 or secondary school, the high school piece specifically, are totally separate worlds. Not only are the expectations different, but the laws that govern them are different. And it's so crucial for students to be prepared for that big shift because, you know, research has demonstrated over and over again, the more transition support they get and the more aware of these changes, the more successful those individuals are going to be once they get to higher education. So I just want to spend a couple minutes discussing the major differences as Tabitha presented. Well, the first thing to think about is K-12 education is guaranteed. If you are born in this country, you are entitled to a high school diploma if you go through, or you're at least entitled to participate in high school and exit if you can. So IEPs and 504 plans are mandated. And I'm going to keep referencing IEPs throughout this quick discussion, but let's think about how college is a little different. Not everybody is entitled to go to college. You have to be otherwise qualified to be there, no matter if you're using accommodations or not. So I'll go over a couple of the big changes, but we have to remember high school, you're entitled to be there and get support. College, not so much. So keep that in mind throughout this. The first piece I want to discuss is the identification of disability. So in the K-12 world, we know that students with disabilities are guaranteed special education if they qualify with one of the 14 disabilities and they need special education. And the way we figure this out is via a provision in IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That provision is called Child Find. In our country, schools are legally required to identify, locate, and evaluate students with disabilities, free of cost to the parents. So let's get our kids evaluated in K-12 education, because guess what happens after? Once a child exits high school, there is no more guaranteed evaluations and certainly not identification. So one of the biggest things when I would work with high school students transitioning to post-secondary ed was to make sure before they exited their high school that they had updated evaluations, not just an IEP. Some universities might accept that as documentation, but most universities want a formal psychoeducational evaluation or a neuropsychological evaluation, the actual testing, or any other kind of physical or sensory evaluations. They want the actual testing that shows the student has a documented disability. Because guess what? When you get to college, if you march into the office and you say, hey, I have a disability, but I don't have paperwork, they're going to say, go get some. And by the way, you have to pay for it. And it's kind of a bummer, but insurance covers $0 typically of a neuropsychological evaluation. And that's the battery of intelligence tests that can typically diagnose learning disabilities, ADHD, any kind of cognitive or intellectual disabilities. And they cost between $3,000 to $5,000, and that's the low end. So tip one, make sure people have evaluations because they're not covered in higher education. Some universities are starting to try to provide evaluations for low or no cost, but they are far and few between. So that's one of the biggest pieces. The second biggest piece is when students are in K-12 education, they are guaranteed, based on what they need to succeed, they're guaranteed accommodations, which just provide access, don't change the learning requirements, just provide ways to get the information, for instance, audiobooks, or ways to demonstrate that they know the information, extra time on tests, maybe a written test can be typed instead. Again, not changing what's being assessed, just providing different access. Modifications are also available in K-12, but that includes changing what the student's actually learning. For instance, instead of taking a test with 100 questions, maybe a student only has to take one with 30 questions. So they're demonstrating less knowledge. They might be learning different material as well. Another piece of K-12 education is also that special education, individualized instruction and support. So students come to college prepared with all that, and sometimes they expect the same thing. But again, remember, the rules are different. In K-12, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is in place. That's an educational law. By the time they get to post-secondary education, that law has ceased functioning. That is done when students exit K-12. Now the protections they have are civil rights protections, which only guarantee reasonable accommodations, which provide access, like I said. So modifications cannot be in place in college, legally anyway. I mean, maybe some colleges might be willing to do that, but overall, the laws, the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as the Rehabilitation Act, specifically Section 504, guarantees accommodations. So again, extra time on tests, maybe different materials to study with, different ways to access the information and demonstrate people know it, but modifications and often that individualized education not going to be in place. So another piece that's important to know is when students are in K-12 education, they're going to have these big documents guiding all their progress and all their supports they need. Again, IEPs, which can be 30 pages, and even 504 plans, which only list accommodations, but they're still a little more detailed. When they get to college, it's on them. They basically have to go to the Disability Services Office, self-disclose on their own, provide that documentation, and advocate for what they need. And sure, the office is going to record what reasonable accommodations are going to be in place, but they're certainly not going to develop a robust plan in many cases. It's pretty much going to be a list of the accommodations. And then in closing, my quick little note about the differences, I think the biggest change is student responsibility. In K-12 education, special educators are awesome and they cover all the bases. They're going to make sure students are doing their homework. If they're late, if they forget to use their accommodations, they're going to remind them, they're going to put that in place. By the time a student gets to college, there's usually nobody checking in on them in that regard. It's up to them again to self-disclose once and register, but often they have to request letters of accommodation each semester, and that's on them. If they need help studying or they need coaching tactics, time management, it's on them to realize they need that help and they have to go to the office and find someone and seek out that assistance themselves. So I think the biggest overall change, in addition to the laws and the requirements, is that students with disabilities really need to be responsible for their own education and the supports that they need.
Thanks, and
Sure.
Emily, sorry. Full disclosure, I actually do. They are my colleagues. I have worked many years prior in disability services as well. So my colleagues and my friends, I do know them. So that's so yes, and so in addition to those laws and the responsibility shift, the actual learning environment is very different as well. And many students are really, I think, shocked by how different just the environment itself is, in addition to all these laws that change and this shift in responsibility. Lori and Judy, do you have any comments, anything
Yeah.
that you'd like to add to what Emily has said?
I do.
I do. Go ahead, Emily.
Go ahead. Lord. You know, I was thinking this, well, obviously the same thing, right? This learning environment, what are we doing in it, right? What's the big change in the classroom and what's the big change outside of the classroom? So you have an increase in workload. You have an increase in a social life, most likely. You have an increase in trying to stay in communication with your family. So your transition is not just the college itself, but it's in many different realms. There's an increase in how you need to regulate yourself. Self-regulation increases, independence increases, and the big word that I like to use is interdependence needs to increase. So now you really need to start to understand what you need when you need it and what are your resources at that time. And research does support students with disabilities do better when they access their resources when they need them. So not only do you need to be aware of your learning needs, how do you function in school, what do you need to do well, you then need to also have a sense of what's the impact then on me personally and or socially, and start to think about those things too. But all of those things increase. So now you have to really be very aware of the balance of school. And another little piece in there that I hope people start to think about way ahead of time is what are the classes you're taking? What are the courses you're taking? What might be the reading load? What might be the assignments? How often do you have a test? How big are those tests? Students can get in contact with professors even before they begin college to see what does the class look like? What are the expectations of me? Can I handle 5 classes if I'm taking 3 with super heavy reading loads and I actually need more time to process what I'm reading? I have to think about those things and be really delicate with it. One of the biggest things that students might start to think is, I'm tired of having this IEP. I'm tired of being someone with a disability. I'm going to get rid of it all when I start. And they're hitting an environment where everything is getting bigger and everything is getting harder, and they're taking away supports for themselves. No, you got to think just the opposite. Let me start to address what I need in this particular setting. And that's the deal too. Not in every setting does a disability demonstrate. You have to remember that. Just because you have a diagnosis doesn't mean you have a disability. All it means is that you might be in a setting that hones in on something that you're more challenged by. And so you want to demonstrate what you know and not demonstrate what you're more challenged by. Set up your accommodations, figure things out early on, meet people in that disability services office, get to know the other resources on campus and support so that you can access them when you need them and become familiar with things. And don't be a stranger to any of those things, and don't wait to get help.
Big message right there. Don't.
Right.
Yeah.
Great
it's never-
information, Lori. I do want to say just one extra thing. Actually, Lori covered so much of it. That one of the differences that students and their parents sometimes have difficulty with is that in a K through 12, the information is broadcast. A lot of people know about the students' needs, and the IEP can involve several different people. When you go to college and the laws change, we're there to protect the privacy of the individual rather than broadcasting it. So where a college disability services office needs to know what the disability is and its impact on the education, faculty and staff might not need to know that information. Many times don't. So that information is not shared, particularly not shared by the disabilities office. It might be shared by the student, and that is their choice. But it is a more private experience where the communication from between the student and the disability office to faculty and staff really speaks to specifically accommodations and not the depth and breadth of the disability.
That's excellent. Thank you, Judy. And that's actually a really great segue into the next topic, is what to know about accommodations. So when, how, what, and when should students seek accommodations, and how should they do that? So Judy, do you mind starting up the
Sure.
conversation about accommodations? When and how should students seek accommodations?
It's been alluded to or mentioned as far as a student registering with the disabilities office at the college or university that they're attending. That ideally should happen either in the late spring before they enter that school or during the summer. And I'm going to say something, being in one of those offices for many years, that to take a look at the practicality of time. We kind of all know when our time crunches come in our careers or even at home, the disability services offices are a little less busy during the summer, chances are. They don't have a full load. They might have summer session that they're monitoring, but they're getting ready for that next year to come. I'm also looking at if you need to contact a disabilities office during the course of a term to look at the scheduling. You can find this online because all calendars are online. When does school start? In the beginning of a semester, it's mayhem. Complete mayhem. Students are getting settled. They're coming into the office. There are needs. There's a lot of new people to get to know. Also, many schools have a midterm process and a finals process. Again, offices are quite busy with students in making sure their accommodations are provided for. So looking at any notation in calendars before you might contact an office if you have the time. So ideally, late spring, summertime before the student starts. But also it was mentioned that students do need to tell the offices their courses as they register for their courses. It's not an automatic that everyone knows what you're taking that particular term. And also it may need a conversation with the student and the disability services provider, what kind of accommodations uniquely are needed for that particular course and maybe not for another course that the student is taking. So sometimes the one-on-one and the individualization is critically important. There are many, many course accommodations, and it so much depends on the school. And this is another thing that I will promote, is to say when a student is looking at choosing schools, I highly encourage families, parents and the students, or just the student, but I always welcome parents for lots of good reasons, to try to connect with the disability services office before the final decision is made. Is there a match? Is there a comfortable feeling in the way that you're hearing that they provide services, and what might they provide? Most offices will not guarantee particular services for an individual student before they have the documentation in hand of the disability and they know that the student is going to attend that university, that they've committed to the school. But finding that out ahead of time kind of puts everybody a little bit more at ease when the beginning stages of that student's experience in college starts. There are also, as the question of when, and I speak of the beginning of a semester, some of the schools have some policies about when a student can approach the office. I believe truly, because disability can occur at any time and at any moment, that there should be a flowing service, that you should be able to approach an office at any time. And let me give you an example of that. There are accidents that occur. A student might break their dominant arm and can't take a test in a regular way. That happens 2 days before an exam. Well, we might negotiate with the faculty to delay the test, but we also might look at really quickly at the accommodations that are needed so that that student can take the test on time. But that's kind of an abrupt situation. And I think we're kind of talking about pre-existing conditions when a student is going into school. So that is highly recommended before the school starts and also each semester that the student is registering for classes. The other thing that has been mentioned is accommodations being reasonable. That is a really important word. And I truly smile
big-
because there's no definition on the word reasonable. And I've asked it many, many times in my career, and I probably got a smile back from anybody trying to answer that. Reasonable also depends on the college or university and what resources they may have to offer. So again, a good reason why, as much as you may be choosing a university or a college because of its reputation, the courses offered, its location, for whatever reason, these are other things that are probably equally important for the success of the student as they go through the school. I'm going to mention some real quick accommodations. I'm going to kind of list them because some of them may be surprising. And I did try to think consistently of students perhaps with learning differences, whether it be a learning disability or ADHD, just changes in the way that they manipulate and can learn information. The taping of a class. Sometimes we think, oh yeah, the student can just turn on their phone in the class and tape a class. It actually requires the permission of a faculty member. I learned, surprisingly, that there are some faculty who have their lectures copyrighted, and therefore it really would be an offense. Sometimes it can be known that someone is taping the class and the faculty member finds out, and that's kind of not a good thing as far as the student is concerned. Of course, online classes that have been developed since COVID have actually been a wonderful opportunity for many students who need to kind of rewind and replay information in the same way they might have in just taping a class that they sat in live. So there has been a really good effort in terms of the online classes. The use of a computer in the classroom. Now, many of our students are really much more agile writing on a keyboard than they are with pen or paper in hand. And interestingly enough, I have known this, that faculty members have actually prohibited the use of computers in classrooms. Why? Because when you go to the back of the class, when you look at a sea of monitors, all you see is social media, and the faculty members try to control the attention of the entire class by saying no computers. Well, we have a reason. This particular student actually does need a computer for note-taking purposes. And the implication of that is, if that permission is granted, and usually it is, the student needs to know that they're the only one in the classroom sitting there with a computer. Therefore, they're a little different. There's something obviously different about that student. How well is that student willing to accept that? Some students said, I don't care, this is what I need. Other students say, oh, I never thought about that. And faculty will point that out to people as well and point it out to students. So it's kind of you don't think about these things until you think about them all the way through. The use of an FM system in a class where a student might be using a headset or earplugs, a little bit more difficult to arrange, but again, the noise distraction is kind of filtered out and can work with some students. Most commonly in classrooms, I found, were peer note takers, people taking notes in class for the students. And there was another thing that I actually probably laughed every time I heard it requested, was preferential seating, and that meant seating in the front row. My statement to that is, in a college setting, get to class early enough. And if you have any difficulty finding a front row seat, come on back, because most of the time those front row seats are not going to be occupied. Other accommodations are involve the course evaluation process, extended time on exams, really common as far as an accommodation is concerned. How is that rendered with the office? Does the student take the exam with the class? Does the grad student or the faculty stay with them for the extended time? Or are they expected to work with the disabilities office and a different location for their test? Extension on projects and papers, again, hear about often as far as a request. Bit of a problem, because if a person can't keep up with the course as it's moving forward, they only get further and further behind. There is an end to the semester where things have to be submitted. So it's unlikely to have an agreement on an extension of a paper or project. There's some wiggle room, but not a lot. Scantron papers, ironically, again, things that we don't think about. People who have problems filling in those bubbles. Is there a different way for the student to mark their tests? Yes, there is. Can we have an exception made? And also, this goes into
I'm going to give you one
resources.
more, Judy.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to give you one. No, I'm going to give you the chance to say one more, just because of time
One
and we
more,
have to get through it. But
I was good.
I'm going to follow up with something. You go ahead.
One more, and it was private testing rooms. Okay, so I will speak to private testing rooms. Some people really do work better when there's nothing around, and it's a quiet room. It depends on the resources of the school. Can they provide that? So again, it's the question. Those are some of the questions to ask. Okay.
Yeah, and so I think we can see here with how complex and multifaceted that accommodations are. And people, it's often, and we did provide people an opportunity to ask questions in advance. And so there were a lot of questions. What types of accommodations are available in higher ed? It's really difficult to just say, here's a menu, here's a list of items. While some of the things that Judy just spoke about are common. There's some of the more common types of accommodations. It's really important to think about, not in a menu form,
Right.
but what is it that I as a student need? What is it that I'm trying to mitigate? What is my disability? What is the manifestation of that disability? What is it that I'm trying to mitigate that will give me access, that I can demonstrate, that I can fully participate in my program, my classes, and demonstrate the knowledge that I have? So really working from that paradigm is going to serve a student much better than thinking about, what do you have for me? And I'll let Lori, I saw you had your hand up, and then Emily, if you have any other thoughts to add to that.
Yeah, so that's such great information. Thank you. The thing I was thinking about when Judy was talking, two things. One is that in college, the interactive process is what this is all about with the student. And per Tabitha's comment about no menu, there's no menu that you choose from. This is about the student understanding him or herself, having a conversation with disability services and the need that's there. And the other piece of this is, K through 12, the IEP is what is servicing your particular accommodations, and you're waiting for that next meeting to change something potentially. In college, that's not how this works. If you're in a classroom in the spring semester and something has changed for you, and now you actually need something different than what you needed in the fall, you need to go to disability services and talk about that. So at any given time, whether it's a broken arm or some other need that you're finding is happening for you in learning, you might need to add an accommodation and or not use one that you have that you determined the previous semester for. So it can change that much over time. And I'm sure we'll talk about documentation too throughout this, in and out, but that's a tricky thing too, right? Yes, there needs to be a history. That's in the case law. There has to be a history of a disability in order to receive accommodation. But every institution has the right to determine their own documentation rules. And so that's speaking back to what Emily's saying, most schools will want to see more than that. And yet I have worked at schools that were very progressive, that when we had that history of disability in that IEP, we understand there's a disability. We're not going to put you through 10 steps to be re-diagnosed. And we're going to say, yes, let's listen to what you're saying in that interactive process, what's happening for you. And let's find ways to make this environment accessible where you can fully participate. And that's where those resources for every school, as Judy mentioned, is so important. And getting to know the school. You may want to go to a particular school for a certain reason, but visit that disability services office, know what they have for accommodation, and then something separate, which I call services, right? They might go above and beyond what they are legally required to do. They might have one-on-one support that you don't pay for. Other schools might have one-on-one support that you do pay for. So it varies, but that accommodation process, the earlier you do it and register, the better you're going to be and more prepared you're going to be because of time. But just know that you can ask for an accommodation at any time in your college career. You are legally okay to do that.
And I just wanted
Definitely.
to speak for a second from the professor side of things about the negotiation that happens between instructors and professors and disability services folks, and sometimes the student as well. So typically students are just going to work with disability services, say, here's my disability, here are my needs, here are the accommodations that I think are going to work. And that last piece, disability services, will hope really help with. But let's just say the disability services notifies the professor and the professor says, no, that's going to make my class easier. That's not fair. Well, it doesn't end there, luckily. Typically what happens is a disability services office will say, okay, well, what are the learning objectives of the course? Why is this going to lower the requirements? And that's kind of where the discussion or debate even comes in. A professor has to be able to show, here are the learning objectives of my course. For instance, if it's know these 7 laws and what they do, extra time in a test isn't going to change that. It's not going to lower the requirements. So the disability services office could say, nope, sorry, this student gets extra time in the test. However, let's just say it's maybe a nursing exam where the student has to perform a certain clinical skill in a certain amount of time. They can then say, look, they have to know these skills and the time is a learning objective. In that case, extra time would change the learning objective and it wouldn't be a reasonable accommodation. And typically how most schools I've worked with define reasonable accommodation is, one, again, doesn't change the learning objectives, doesn't make it easier, but also that it basically doesn't bankrupt the school. Schools have pushed back and said, oh, it's not reasonable. Well, the way the Americans with Disabilities Act defines reasonability is that it's feasibly possible. And let me tell you, institutions of higher ed have loads of money. So that hasn't really held up in the court of law so far.
Not, case law
Good.
has not supported that. There's been no
Nope.
no decision made on a financial basis whatsoever.
Exactly.
Yep.
But you will hear that. You do
Yep.
hear that.
You will
pushback
hear
for
it,
sure.
but
Yeah.
So we can't afford
good
it.
to know. Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. We've all been deep in those conversations,
Yes,
as you can tell.
indeed.
Um, Thank you all. So we are a little over half time, and we're halfway through. So let's talk a little bit about student pitfalls and successes. I know we have a lot of questions. Please keep typing them in. We do have some questions that we're going to be answering later, and then also getting to new ones. So you can see this topic has lots of tentacles and is very deep and can get quite complex. So there is lots to know, and it is always also, and along with the interactive process, that someone should really keep in their mind and explore more what that is, and the complexities of that process between student and disability service provider. Also case by case is also really important to think about, because it goes back to that menu. So it's always case by case, what a student needs, why they need it, what's possible. So on that, my rant, student pitfalls. So Lori, we know that parents are a very important part in the process of a student's education, extremely important. And what are some things that parents can do to support their students in getting them ready for college, and also while they're in college, to help bolster their independence?
This is a pretty big question.
Really, also a very big question.
It's a very big question, right?
Yeah.
I'll
yeah.
look to my colleagues to jump in too as we go over this, because you're either going to feel super prepared as a parent and think they are ready, man, they are so ready, or you're going to think, oh, no, I still need to be there. I still need to pick up here and pick up there if they're going to be successful in college. And as you're hearing from us all, the deal is this: even though in the research around college students entering their freshman year, they are developmentally, emotionally about the age of 15, believe it or not, they're still heading there alone without you. And so they do need to understand themselves extremely well. That's the expectation. And therefore, you're going to need to understand those needs very well and have these conversations. And sometimes that's harder and sometimes that's easier depending on the kids you have. And I always say, I'm an ADHD parent coach, you got to parent the kids you have and not compare them to somebody else. And you're entering a new environment, and you may be either learning this environment for the first time, working with a child with a disability. Maybe you've had a different type of kid go to college already. But that's the deal, is you kind of need to know as much as you can so that information transfers. And I kind of focus on 3 areas. Parents have to understand how well their child manages their day, How do I organize a day? How do I manage a day? Am I using a calendar? Am I using my phone for reminders? Am I managing myself pretty decently? Am I setting aside time to study? Now, this will either be very scary hearing this, or you'll be feeling pretty good about this. And is your child doing this him or herself? Or is this something that you're still scaffolding and prompting, right? So how do I manage a day? How does my child manage a day? Has there been enough scaffolding to do this? Are they ready to head to college and manage their day on their own? That's one. Manage an academic workload is two. Are the skills there? Have they had either an educational experience where they've managed their workload well? Have you provided that environment where they've managed their workload well? Is that student starting to head and do those things independent of you? So they can head to college and do it independently of you. And then the third thing is self-care. How are they managing the self-care? And they all have something to do with each other. When you're managing your day optimally-ish, and you're managing your academic workload better and well, guess what gets to happen? Stress reduces, anxiety reduces, and so you feel better about yourself and your day. You also forgive yourself when you're flubbing up a little bit. So you, in observing to prepare your student, the best for college is to observe how well they're doing these things in these different arenas. And do they have the tools and the strategies to figure things out when they need help? And the other question is, are they ready? And it is okay if they are, and it is okay if they're not. It is okay to say, you know what? Maybe my student needs a gap year. Maybe my student needs a semester at a community college, maybe 2. You'd rather have them be prepared, because the pitfall is when they're not prepared, they don't do well. Or maybe there's a kid who is just very savvy and they can kind of figure it out as they go. And so they might start to kind of figure that out. So the other side of this is, if they head and they're not as prepared, they need to know, when is that withdrawal deadline? Because I'm not doing well in this class. Maybe I do need to take 4 classes at a time instead of 5, and graduate in 6 years instead of 4, or graduate in 5 years instead of 4. So you have to really be aware of the student you have and be super honest with yourself, super honest with your student, so that they don't fall into these pitfalls of, I'm not prepared and I'm thinking within the first month or 3 months, or I don't want to use any accommodations and off I go. Those are the things that I see and, have worked with students on in the past. But bolstering independence, all of those things bolster independence prior to going to college, and will bolster independence when you're in college. If a student, though, needs help, the bolstering of independence in college is asking the questions, doing some coaching yourself. Have you been to the tutoring center? Have you been to, instead of saying, oh my gosh, let me help you write this paper tonight because it's due tomorrow. No, let's backtrack. Have you talked to your professor? Email your professor. Maybe your professor can tell you, or extend a deadline, or tell you you can only earn a particular grade because you're passing this in late. Maybe you already know that. But it's encouraging your son or daughter to take the actions and make the decisions. You're trying to support independent decision-making. You're trying to support independent self-regulation. Doing for them will not help that process. And it might be a little painful, but that's what needs to start to happen in the steps towards independence.
Yeah, and that's sometimes where, there's so many things to consider as I'm listening to you, talk. You're looking at programs, you're talking to the disability services departments. What questions do I ask? What accommodations are available? Is my student ready, and in what ways? And there's a lot going on. There's a lot happening for the parents themselves in the transition as well, which we can hear. And sometimes, having that coach or a support person to help you might be an option for some students as well. So there's a variety of different things to kind of take into account. So in the next 2 minutes, Judy and Emily, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that before we go on to the next topic?
Very quickly, I found that the sense of accountability is so different in college as compared to K through 12, particularly in secondary education. So that whole idea of, as we were just hearing, it's so important for a student to either have a self-imposed accountability, or is there some system or person that can help the accountability? It's very difficult. I will admit myself, as a freshman in college many years ago, My sense of accountability was probably what threw me to the wolves in the first semester that I was a freshman. There's so much to learn. So just to realize, if we look back at ourselves and realize what we did when we went to college, I think that lends something to teaching the future generation what to look for.
I think additionally, and I think Lori touched on this, but I think some of the most important academic skills, students haven't necessarily had to figure them out yet. For instance, what active reading strategies work best for you? A lot of students say, what do you mean active reading? Well, there's a bunch of strategic strategies. And guess what? In college, you're going to get handed a textbook and be told you need to comprehend it. So I think it's super important for high school students to spend that last senior year, and especially this summer before college, identifying those key strategies that work best for them, because they're going to have to do it their first semester. For instance, how do I read? Do I need audiobooks? Do I take notes? Do I highlight? Do I use PDFs that I can make notes on the side? Note taking. How does that work best for me? Paper and pen? Do I need to use a program? Do I just need to type in a Word doc? Do I need to record? And because then that's an accommodation you're going to ask for. Similarly with writing as well. And I think in addition to identifying what academic skills work best for you, as students are researching colleges, I really suggest they also look for other connections. If they realize, oh, writing's not my thing, find a college with a good writing center. Or, because I mean, disability services primarily offers accommodations. And as Lori said, sometimes coaching, but there's a lot of other services that are equally effective. A math center, a writing center, tutoring centers, even the career center. Oh, and that's something else I really think, as a former vocational rehabilitation counselor, I think figuring out what you're doing in college needs to start in kindergarten. Personally, I really highly recommend working with that career services center early on, taking those silly interest inventories. Would you rather build a boat or act in a play? They're silly, but they're validated, and they're really going to help people start thinking about, what do I want to learn, and what am I going to do with that after? And that's also going to shape the types of supports they need. So lots of prep ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you. And that actually does go into our last, our topic is preparing for college. So I think everything that you all have talked about is preparing for a student for college, and there's quite a bit. Parents are either relieved or on the edge of their seat at this point in the in the discussion. But if you could pull out or think of one thing, just one thing quickly that maybe you would say is really, really important. Again, you can only say one thing right now because we have so many questions we have to get to. So what would you say is one of the top things that comes to mind in preparing a student for their transition to college?
I'm going to say know your strengths and know your challenges.
Judy.
Being able to manage yourself within a larger group of people that you're going to be living with 24/7, difference than at home.
Yeah, very good one. Very
Make
good.
connections. The research shows that the strongest indicator of college retention and college completion is that students have a sense of belonging, whether that means joining a club, finding a cool roommate, connecting with a professor, a graduate student. So reaching out and finding where you can start to explore those connections. So when you get there, you can hit the ground running and really try to connect with somebody academically, extracurricularly, because again, that's really going to help students feel supported while they're adjusting to this new setting.
Right.
Absolutely.
That's great. Thank you. All right. So we're going to have these are quick fire questions, sort of, kind of, not really, but we're going to do the best to get through them quickly. There's some questions that have been posed.
Oh, I've been writing in the chat to try to be helpful.
Oh, you have
been answering some of them.
Nice.
Okay, so the good professor that you are, Emily. Thank you. I appreciate that. So to families and people who are participating. Good multitasker. There's no such thing, but otherwise you should do it. Lori, there's a question, how to best support college students with ADHD who are struggling to motivate to do their assignments?
Yeah,
especially when assignments have piled up and deadlines are approaching.
Yeah,
It's a big
that's a
one.
common one, right? That's super common. I'm gonna, the reason why I mentioned strengths and challenges as being so important, and even in this process, when we're talking about the interactive process and students, the expectation is them knowing themselves very well, which they're not practiced at, right? This doesn't happen in high school typically. Is that when you have ADHD and you know what your brain is or isn't, one of the things you must know is that this is not a matter of motivation. It's actually a matter of something called activation. The ADHD brain struggles with activating. It needs fear and or excitement to activate. I hope that blows everybody's mind out there that doesn't know this yet, because otherwise we see it as procrastinating. And that's why students are like, I'm not a procrastinator. And yet for 12 years, they've been told they are, and they kind of know they're not, but yet they kind of start to accept it. Yeah, maybe I am that square peg in that round hole. The brain, there's research around this. It is a well-known, has trouble activating without fear or excitement. So when the night before comes, guess what's happening? Fear, or maybe excitement, but fear most likely. That pressure lets the ADHD brain activate and they can get the work done. The problem is that time now is not on their side. So that assignment may not reflect what they actually know. It might not even reflect their skills or abilities because they don't have the time. So this question is super relevant, because if there's a class that has a lot of assignments and things start to pile up because of that issue with activation when you need to, very hard to force the brain to activate when you need to. You can't do it just by thinking. You have to change the chemistry of the brain. So now it might be a bit of reconnaissance, depending on where are you. First of all, meet with your professors to see where you are sitting in that class, even if that work is piled up. You may not know that you're passing. You might think that you're failing. 1, so meet with your professors. 2, do you need to do something like withdraw from a class because you need to lighten the workload and let go of something to finish the rest of the work, right? And 3, this is where those strategies like Emily's talking about, Judy's talking about, when it comes to either accommodations or other strategies, like active reading strategies that you need to be familiar with throughout the semester prior to this point, so you don't get to this point, right? Or how do I manage a day with my calendar? And how do I get some work done that is going to be super hard to get done because I do have trouble with activation? Am I doing my homework in the right environment? I have to leave my room, go away from my roommate, or I'm going to talk the ear off and I'm not going to get anything done. You need to know what environment you work best in. You need to know the tools you need in that environment in order to work. Do you need to make sure that you can dictate your papers? Do you need to make sure that you're in a quiet setting? Do you need to listen to music as you do your homework? Do you need a timer? Do you need to use the Pomodoro method? I can work for 30 minutes, take a 15-minute break, and come back. You need to know the strategies you need to get the work done. And I will say this too, when I've learned over the years and working with so many students as an ADHD parent coach and just a learning specialist, is this is never going to be perfect for you. It's just not. This is executive functioning, and this is part of what is a challenge for the ADHD brain. So many other fantastic strengths that I could talk to you about till I'm blue in the face, but this is not one of them. And the college environment asks you to use your executive function in the school environment all day, every day, boom, 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 boom. Your tank is going to be pretty low by the end of the day because you're working twice as hard, 3 times as hard as the next kid with executive functioning. So forgive yourself and begin again when you need to, but get done what you can. This is a really hard one, but you do have to do some reconnaissance if this is the space you're in to find out where you're really at with each class. What can you conceivably pass in when you need to, and what you need to let go of to still pass a class or get a B in that class, or get the A that you're searching to get. I hope that makes sense. But it can be a really challenging thing,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you find yourself in those kind of that space, it's difficult to find your way out of it. And
Paralyzing.
it can be very paralyzing. So I think, knowing, like you said, knowing yourself and also really focusing on that skill development. So it is really more about, more than just passing one class, that, getting a tutor. Tutors are great. But really that's about, I make this distinction between, between just passing a class and getting by and really developing the skills. So is it transactional with, tutoring, or is it transformational? And what we want is transformational. So we're taking these
Absolutely.
classes, but we want to build the skills for long-term success.
Absolutely.
And really
so you
so
can
that
flourish.
yeah,
And
yep,
thrive and bring those
absolutely.
skills to your life after college.
May I ask
Exactly.
though, what is the reaction of a parent if a child does fail?
Oh, that's such a good question.
That's another webinar.
Okay.
That's another webinar,
Okay.
because you're right.
Great question.
All right.
It is a great question, though. It is a deep question, and an
Absolutely.
important one for sure.
Yeah.
One of the, just pragmatically, Emily, we had a question also, and I can see that you're busy answering questions. Thank you so much for doing that. What services can be requested through what agency for the college years? Any advice on financial assistance from universities under the ADA 504?
Sure. So I actually just answered the ADA 504 one, but I'll tell you what I said.
Oh, you did?
The
Okay.
short answer is not too much. The ADA
Yeah.
and the Rehabilitation Act, which is where 504 comes from, really just talks about access. They're anti-discrimination laws. They are civil rights laws. And they say students with disabilities must be able to complete college with or without reasonable accommodations. Hard stop, period. Neither of the laws address financial aid in any ways. But, I get it. That's a pragmatic concern. If a student needs to learn more slowly and take longer, that's going to cost extra tuition. But to my knowledge, I believe the only avenues are, Pell Grants or typical grants from the government, typical financial aid. However, I will say there are some scholarships and grants from individual foundations, and at some universities, they also have funding specifically for students with disabilities, but that would be on a case-by-case basis. Overall, there's no automatic funding, even though there should be, in my opinion. The second question, Tab, was about funding. The agencies, right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another disappointing answer. Adult agencies in our country for students with disabilities, not so hot, particularly for students or for individuals who don't have significant support needs. There are more agencies for that, but the biggest one I want to talk about is vocational rehabilitation. And I know people have mixed feelings, but as a former VR counselor, I think every student who has a disability should try to sign up for vocational rehabilitation. There are basically 3 eligibility criteria. 1, you have to have a disability. If you don't have that documentation, VR is legally mandated to pay for it. They cannot charge $1 for diagnostic services. Yes, you might be on a wait list for a year or something, but connect with vocational rehabilitation. There's typically an agency in every county, and they're technically part of the federal government, but run by state government. So vocational rehabilitation, I can't say it enough. You have to have a disability, you have to want to work, and you have to be able to work competitively. And competitively means earning at or above minimum wage, typically full-time, but it doesn't have to be. So most college students would meet that criteria. And of course, there's wait lists, and, sometimes there's something called the order of selection where VR agencies will only serve people with the most significant needs. But right now, I don't believe it's a state-by-state thing, but I don't think that's happening too much. I highly recommend that. When I was a VR counselor, my entire caseload was college students, and I basically served as an extra disability services person. I would do it on the career side more so, but I would work with them to talk about how the accommodations they're using in college would transfer to the workforce. For folks who were just coming out of high school, I would work with them to help them figure out how the accommodations they used in high school would transfer to college and then to the workforce. And again, they can do that career development piece that I was talking about. So I think vocational rehabilitation is certainly the biggest recommendation I would make. And one other quickie. So one of the biggest reasons students do not register with disability services, and by the way, that is the biggest reason that college students with disabilities have identified as not succeeding in college, because they don't get reasonable accommodations. So they should register, but the biggest reason they don't is stigma. And I think one of the biggest ways around that is to really build up that disability identity. I should have said this in my intro, but I also identify as a disabled scholar. I have a traumatic brain injury that affects me every day. I use accommodations in my workplace as a professor. I use them in college as a student. And I really think it can help to find agencies for adults with disabilities and connect. Many colleges have peer supports, like a disability awareness club, or just an affinity group. But even for folks on the spectrum or for ADHD, they have just like national groups like AANE, the Autism Asperger's Network, or ASN. I forget what that stands for. It's autism something else. But anyway, they're just affinity groups where people can talk about their disability identity. So I really think it's important that, you know, we fight that disability stigma by empowering students to learn about themselves and learn about the experiences of other people with disabilities.
I think it's excellent. It's great advice, and that identity piece is huge and develops over time. For sure. Somebody had a question that's actually for me. What about paths instead of college? What portion of Winston Prep community attends college versus training programs? So of course, next steps are really highly individualized and dependent on what is best for the student. So it's sometimes kind of not this straight trajectory, this even. Usually we look back on our own lives, those are older. Sometimes it can kind of look like this, but at Winston Prep, looking back over the last couple of years, our records, it looks like between 85 to 90% of our students go to college. 10% attend a transition programming, such as like a Mansfield Hall, or we do at Winston have two transition, we have a transition program, one campus in New York and one in San Francisco. And 3% attend vocational training programs, and 2% of our students go on to the workforce directly. That's that one. There is somebody has, it's actually kind of long, but a College Board approval for testing accommodations. I do have your email. I'm going to email you directly about that. But College Board just note that they are changing their testing processes. So be aware of that. I would recommend for people to contact the College Board to discover also what any of those, to firsthand what those changes are and how that's going to affect any type of standardized testing that your student might go through.
Tabitha, if I may mention also timing
Sure.
on that. If they require testing that's within the last year and your testing is not of the last year, I think most people know it's going to take months to get on the docket to get tested. So to start early is the statement I'm making.
Yeah.
To check in.
Well, thank you. I can't believe we're out of time. There's so much more to talk about. But I appreciate so very much people attending and carving out the time to interact through questions and to hear what we have to say. And to the three of you, also Lori, Judy, and Emily, you have done amazing things for thousands of students and have been such strong professionals and advocates. And I know those students appreciate it now and will for a very long time, and I definitely do. So, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everyone. Have a
Thank you
great
so
day.
much, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you. Good luck to everybody.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.